Log entry, July 16th. Time irrelevant. This is Senior Ranger Eli Tate, Station 4, Clackamas District. If anyone finds this recording, the rules are real. They're not superstition. They're not protocol. They're a goddamn leash, and it just broke. The sky is wrong. Don't come looking. Don't send a team. Burn the maps. Let the forest have this mountain. God, let it be enough. 3 months earlier, the pay is a 20% hazard bump, plus a solitude stipend. All in, you're so clear, 6 figures. My prospective boss, Regional Director Henderson, didn't look at me when he said it. He was focused on a spot on the wall behind me. A water stain shaped vaguely like a screaming face. In my experience, men who can't hold eye contact when talking about money are either lying or ashamed. Henderson didn't strike me as a liar. A solitude stipend? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Estent spent 8 years in the army, 2 tours in the Korengal. Solitude and I were old acquaintances. That sep's a new one. Station 4 isn't your typical post, Tate, he said, his gaze finally dropping to the file on his desk. My file, it's our most remote station, sits at 4,500 feet, smack in the middle of the Kellen Creek watershed. No road access for the last 5 miles. You hike or ATV in. Supply drops are once a month, by helicopter. Your nearest human being is a solid 30 miles south, at the tourist campground. He sounded like a real estate agent selling a cursed house, highlighting the isolation as a feature, not a bug. I'm fine with being alone, sir. It's why I joined the Forest Service. Good. He finally met my eyes. They were tired, netted, with fine lines, the color of faded denim. Because you will be alone, that is. He leaned forward, pulling a small laminated card from his desk drawer. It was dog-eared, the plastic yellowed with age. He slid it across the polished wood. This is the most important piece of gear you'll be issued. It doesn't go in a manual. It doesn't get filed. You live by it. When you're sure you have it down, you burn it. I picked it up. It felt heavy, more than its weight in plastic and paper would suggest. The text was typed, simple and stark, against a white background. Station 4, standing orders. Do not leave the station building between official sunset and sunrise. No exceptions. If you hear your name, or any name, called from the forest, do not answer or acknowledge. No reflective surfaces larger than a standard issue compass mirror are permitted outdoors. All station windows are to remain shuttered after dark. Report all anomalous animal sightings via the red phone only. Use code AUR or for bipedal ungulates. Do not record these sightings in the official daily log. Never follow trails of arranged objects, stones, feathers, carved wood. Report their location and composition, then return to station. If the forest becomes completely silent, no wind, no insects, no birds, lock all doors and windows. Do not look outside for a minimum of 1 hour. This is a Condition 0 event. Ravens are a protected species in this district. Do not harm them. They are your only reliable early warning system. I read the list twice. It felt like a practical joke. A hazing ritual for the new guy. Bipedal. Ungulates. Deer that walk on 2 legs. This is a joke, right? I asked, a smile touching my lips. Henderson's expression was granite. The man you're replacing, Marcus Thorne, was a fine ranger, a geologist by trade, meticulous, sharp as a tack. He'd been up there 3 years. We think he got complacent, started taking soil samples after dusk. His family got a flag and a very generous pension. Nothing. Boss sting. The smile died on my face. What happened to him? His pack and tools were found a half-mile from the station, near a creek bed, Henderson said, his voice dropping to a low, clinical monotone. Everything was neatly laid out. His rock hammer, his sample bags, his GPS unit. No sign of a struggle. No prints other than his own. No sign of Marcus. I looked back, down at the card. It suddenly felt cold in my hand. These orders, where did they come from? They said been in place since the station was built in the 50s, passed from one ranger to the next. We don't question them, Tate. We just follow them. Can you do that? It was a test of my ability to follow protocol without question. The same way the army had tested me. Don't ask why you start taking the hill. Just take it. I nodded slowly. Yes, sir, I can. The first 2 weeks at Station 4 were the most peaceful of my life. The hike-in was grueling, but the air up here was different. So clean and sharp, it felt like it was scrubbing my lungs with every breath. The station itself was a fortress in miniature, built from thick, timber-framed logs with a steep metal roof to shed the heavy mountain snows. It was larger than I expected, with a main living area, a comms room, a small bedroom, and a workshop. And just as Henderson had said, the windows were fitted with heavy, internal steel shutters that I dutifully bolted every night at sunset. The only mirror was a small 6-inch square screwed to the bathroom wall. I fell into a routine. Mornings were for maintenance and checks. I'd walk the perimeter, check the fuel levels for the generator, and make sure the solar array was clear of debris. Afternoons, I'd patrol. My designated area was a 50-square-mile patch of some of the oldest old-growth forest in North America. The Douglas firs and western red cedars were giants, their tops hidden in the low-hanging mist, their trunks wider than my truck. The forest floor was a deep, damp carpet of moss and ferns, and the silence was profound, broken only by the chatter of a Steller's jay or the distant rush of Kellen Creek. I felt watched. It was a common feeling in the wilderness, the primal part of your brain, reminding you that you're not at the top of the food chain anymore. I dismissed it. My job was to check the automated trail cameras, document flora and fauna for the district surveys, and keep an eye out for any signs of fire. The first anomaly was small. Comra C7, at the northern edge of my patrol zone, had a corrupted memory card. I brought it back to the station and ran a diagnostic. All 300 files were unreadable data sludge, except for the very last one. The camera was aimed at a game trail, and the infrared flash had captured something moving past. It was mostly a blur of brown fur, but at the bottom of the frame was a leg. It was long and slender, like a deer's, but it was bent forward at the knee joint, like a man's. The hoof was cloven, but it seemed to be pressing into the dirt with an intelligence that felt wrong. I stared at the image for a long time. It had to be a trick of the light, a distortion from the corrupted data. I logged it as an equipment malfunction and scheduled the camera for replacement, but I didn't delete the image. A few days later, I was hiking back from the eastern ridge. The sun was getting low, painting the undersides of the clouds in brilliant orange and purple. I was about a quarter mile from the station when I heard it. Eli, Eli. It was a whisper on the wind, so faint, I thought I'd imagined it. I stopped dead, straining my ears. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I looked around. The trees stood like silent, solemn judges. There it was again, closer this time. "Eli, come here." It was a woman's voice. Soft, pleading, a cold spike of adrenaline lanced through my gut. My hand went to the canister of bear spray on my belt. I knew Rule #2. If you hear your name, do not answer. This was the test. The hazing. Someone from another station was probably crouched in the bushes with a portable speaker, waiting for me to shout back, so they could all have a good laugh on the radio later. But the voice, it sounded familiar, frighteningly familiar. I turned my back to the sound and walked, my pace steady and deliberate, towards the station. I didn't run. Running invites pursuit. I just walked. The voice followed me, growing more desperate, more sorrowful. It called my name over and over again. I clenched my jaw, focusing on the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel path. I reached the thick wooden door of the station, fumbled with the key, and slipped inside, slamming the heavy bolt home. I leaned against the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. Outside, the voice gave one last, heartbreaking cry. And then there was only the sound of the wind. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about the voice, and about Marcus Thorne, and about the look in Henderson's eyes. I was starting to think this wasn't a joke at all. The next morning, I woke before my alarm, the phantom echo of that voice still caught in my ears. My first instinct, the soldier's instinct, was to face the threat, reconnoiter, understand the enemy's position. My second instinct, the ranger's, was to follow procedure. The rules were the procedure now. After a breakfast of instant coffee and powdered eggs that tasted like chalk, I geared up. I slipped my 10mm Glock from its lockbox and holstered it, a standard precaution against cougars or the occasional black bear, but it felt different today, heavier. I went back to the spot from yesterday, the quarter-mile marker on the trail to the station. I did a full grid search of the area, a 50-meter radius around the point where the voice had been clearest. I moved with methodical slowness, my eyes scanning for any sign of disturbance. A footprint, a broken twig, a patch of scuffed-up pine needles. There was nothing, absolutely nothing. The ground was untouched, covered in a damp layer of fir needles and moss, as pristine as it had been for 100 years. No human could have moved through that undergrowth without leaving a trace. I knew tracking, and there were no tracks to be found. The lack of evidence was more terrifying than finding a boot print. It meant the voice hadn't come from a person. It had come from the forest itself. I finished my patrol, my senses on a razor's edge. Every creak of a branch, every rustle in the undergrowth sent a jolt through my nervous system. I was documenting a patch of ghost pipe, a pale, waxy plant that looks like a clay finger poking from the earth when I saw it, on a large, moss-covered boulder 20 yards off the trail. Someone had arranged a series of objects. It was a perfect, outward spiraling galaxy of raven feathers, dozens of them, the black iridescent in a stray beam of sunlight, each one placed tip to tip to form the elegant curve. In the exact center of the spiral was a single, bleached white deer vertebra. It was a piece of art, macabre, beautiful, and utterly wrong. Rule #5. Never follow trails of arranged objects. Report their location and composition, then return to station. This wasn't a trail, but the intent felt the same. It was a lure, a signpost pointing to something I wasn't supposed to see. My heart rate kicked up a notch. I took out my service phone, the one for official, mundane business, and photographed it, the image feeling illicit, like contraband. I noted the GPS coordinates in my private logbook, not the official one. I wrote down the description: spiral, approx, 3 feet diameter, raven primaries, single cervical vertebra, species unknown, likely deer. Then I turned my back on it and walked away, the feeling of 1,000 unseen eyes boring into my spine. Back at the station, I started paying more attention to the ravens. Rule #7 called them an early warning system, and I was beginning to understand why. They weren't normal birds, they were a constant presence, perched on the station's roof, on the solar panels, on the skeletal branches of a dead pine nearby. They watched me with an unnerving, direct intelligence. Their calls weren't the simple calls I was used to. Sometimes they'd mimic the squeak of the station's front door, or the metallic clang of my water pump. One afternoon, I was field stripping my Glock on the front porch. The pieces laid out on a clean cloth. A big, glossy specimen landed on the railing not 10 feet from me. It puffed its throat and let out a sound. It wasn't a caw or a squeak. It was a perfect replica of the dry, metallic click of the trigger resetting on an empty chamber. Click. It tilted its head, its black bead of an eye fixed on me. Click. I slowly put my weapon back together, my movements deliberate. The raven watched my every move. When I was done, it ruffled its feathers, let out a normal-sounding caw, and launched itself into the air, vanishing over the treetops. I didn't know if it was a warning or a simple observation. I wasn't sure which was worse. The moment that solidified it all. The moment that burned away my last shred of skepticism. Came a week later. It was mid-afternoon. The sky a clear, brilliant blue. I was inside, at the comms desk, logging my weekly equipment status report for Henderson. The gentle ambient noise of the forest was a constant companion up here. The sighing of wind through the 100-foot firs, the drone of bees in the wild azaleas, the distant chatter of squirrels. It was the soundtrack to my life. And then it stopped. It didn't fade. It cut out. 1 second the world was full of sound. The next it was wrapped in a vacuum-sealed silence, so absolute, it felt like a physical blow. My ears popped. The low hum of the station's electronics suddenly sounded like a roar. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Rule #6. If the forest becomes completely silent, lock all doors and windows. Do not look outside for a minimum of 1 hour. This is a Condition 0 event. My training took over. There was no panic. Just a cold, clear flow of action. My chair scraped loudly in the crushing silence as I stood. I walked to the main door, my boots thudding on the wood floors. The heavy bolt was already thrown, but I checked it again. I moved to the nearest window in the main room. I didn't glance outside. My gaze was fixed on the steel shutter. I swung the heavy plate of metal, closed. It met the frame with a dull thump. I rotated the thick iron latch, the sound echoing in the stillness. One by one, I moved through the station, living area, bedroom, workshop, thump, latch, thump, latch, each window sealed, plunging the station into a tomb-like darkness, broken only by the green and red status lights on the comms console. I was now in a box within a box, sealed off. I took the agency-issued shotgun, a Mossberg 590, from its rack and sat in the chair at the comms desk. It was the most central point in the building, the furthest from any exterior wall. I placed the shotgun across my lap and started a timer on my watch. The silence was a living thing. It pressed against the walls of the station, against my eardrums. I could hear my own heart, a frantic, wet thumping in my chest. I could hear the rustle of my own clothes as I breathed. The silence was so profound, it created its own sounds. A high-pitched whine in my inner ear, a low thrum that seemed to vibrate up through the floor. The temptation to go to a window, to slide the shutter open just a crack, and see what a silent world looked like, was overwhelming. It was a physical thirst. What could it be? An atmospheric inversion, a freak weather event. But the rules weren't for understanding, they were for surviving. I focused on my breathing. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The box breathing we learned in the army to handle stress. The minute hand on my watch seemed frozen. Time stretched, bent, and warped in the silent dark. Every creak of the station's old timbers was magnified into a gunshot. Was that a footstep on the porch? A scratch at the door? I couldn't tell. The silence was a canvas, and my fear was painting sounds onto it. Then, exactly as my watch timer beeped, sounding like a cannon blast in the stillness, the sound returned. It wasn't gradual. It was instantaneous. A sudden, violent gust of wind hammered the station, rattling the shutters in their frames. The forest erupted in a cacophony of noise. Birds, insects, the wind itself, as if a cosmic play button had been pressed. I waited another 5 minutes, my shotgun still ready, before I stood and walked to the nearest window. My hand trembled slightly as I unlatched the shutter and pushed it open. Outside, nothing had changed. The sun was in the same spot. The trees were the same. The sky was still a brilliant, indifferent blue. Everything was exactly as it had been 66 minutes ago. Everything except me. I now knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was not a ranger. I was a zookeeper. And I was living inside the cage. For 2 weeks after the Condition Zero event, the forest was deceptively calm. I followed the rules with the devotion of a true believer. I did my patrols, I checked my cameras, and I was back inside with the shutters bolted an hour before sunset. I spoke to Henderson once, during my weekly check-in, my voice a carefully constructed monotone. I reported an equipment malfunction on camera C7 and a structural integrity check on the window shutters. I said nothing about the voice, the feather spiral, or the silence. You don't tell your superiors that you're starting to believe in ghosts. You especially don't tell them when you suspect they've believed all along. The call that changed everything came over the standard district radio, not the red phone. It was a Tuesday. The voice was Rick O'Connell, the head ranger from the Three Creeks district to the south. His voice was tight with stress. All stations, be advised. We have an active search and rescue for a missing hiker in the Three Creeks area. Sarah Collier, female, 21 years old. Last seen near the Kellen Creek trailhead yesterday at 0800 hours. My blood went cold. The Kellen Creek trailhead was at the very edge of my mandated solitude. It was the access point for the public lands that bordered my forbidden zone. Grid search is underway, Othed, Connell continued, his voice crackling with static. Tate, at Station 4. Your operational area borders the northern search sector. We need you to move to the boundary line at Grid 309 and assist. You know that terrain better than anyone. It wasn't a request. I was the closest ranger. Duty was duty. Copy that. Three Creeks, Tate en route to 309. As I gathered my pack, a sense of deep, gut-wrenching dread settled over me. They were all coming to the edge of my cage, and I had to go out and meet them. Before I left, they played a recording of her last contact, a voicemail left on her mother's phone. The voice was bright, clear, and full of life. "Hey, Mom, Just starting up the trail. The mountains look amazing today. Don't worry, I'll be back way before dark. Love you." I listened to the happy, carefree voice and felt like I was listening to a ghost. I met the first SAR team an hour later. The scene was one of controlled chaos. Volunteers in bright orange vests, grim-faced deputies, other rangers. The air buzzed with radio chatter and the efficient, clipped commands of people with a job to do. It was so jarringly normal, it felt surreal. For a few hours sweeping my designated sector with a team of 4 volunteers, I almost felt like a regular forest ranger again. But the sun began to sink lower, casting long, distorted shadows through the trees. The search grew more frantic. We'd found nothing. No pack, no footprints past the first 2 miles of the trail, no broken branches. It was as if she'd been plucked from the earth. Driven by a mix of desperation and professional pride, I pushed ahead of my assigned team, wanting to clear a steep, thickly wooded ravine before we lost the light completely. "Just going to scout the washout ahead," I called back to them. "Maintain your line." The further I went, the quieter it got. The SAR radio chatter faded into intermittent bursts of static. The trees here were older, more gnarled. The air grew still and heavy, and that's when I heard it. "Help! Please, help me." It was a woman's voice, weak and thin, carried on the evening air. It was her, Sarah Collier. I was sure of it. Adrenaline surged through me, overriding the quiet alarm bell ringing in the back of my mind. "This is Forest Service, search and rescue," I yelled, my voice sounding loud in the stillness. "I hear you. Keep calling so I can get a fix on your position. Over here. I think my leg is broken. Please, hurry." I crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face. The voice led me on, always seeming to come from just beyond the next rise, the next thicket of rhododendron. It was leading me west, deeper into the woods, and north, back towards my restricted zone. The sun dipped below the horizon. The forest was plunged into a deep blue twilight, and I realized my mistake. I stopped, pulling out my compass. I'd been led in a wide, cunning circle. I was standing less than 100 yards from the invisible line that marked the start of the Station 4 territory. I was alone. The radio on my chest was silent. I had broken rule of 1. A profound terror, colder and sharper than the mountain air, washed over me. I had been baited, and I had taken it, hook, line, and sinker. I stood frozen, listening. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. Then the voice came again, but it was different. It wasn't Sarah Collier anymore. "Eli, honey, is that you?" I stammered, so lost. "Eli." The world tilted on its axis. My breath caught in my throat. It was the voice of my wife, Lena. She had died 5 years ago. I'd been the one to identify her body at the morgue. I knew death. I knew she was gone. But this voice, it wasn't a memory. It was real. It had her exact timbre, the slight, breathy lisp she had when she was scared. It was the voice I heard in my dreams, the voice I would have given anything to hear again, and it was coming from the impenetrable darkness in front of me. That's what broke me, not the rules, not the silence, but the sheer, calculated cruelty of it. This thing didn't just hunt. It wore the skin of your most profound griefs and used them as a lure. The professional, the soldier, the ranger, they all vanished. Only the husband remained, and he was terrified. I turned and ran. I didn't follow a trail. I just fled, crashing through the darkness. My only guide, the faint silvery light of the rising moon, and the compass in my hand. Behind me the voice followed, a horrifying symphony of sorrow. Sometimes it was Lena, begging me to come back, telling me I'd left her all alone. Sometimes it was Sarah, crying for her mother. The two voices bled into one another, twisting into something monstrous. I burst from the tree line into the clearing around the station. The squat, dark building was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I sprinted across the open ground, my lungs burning, the key already in my hand. I could feel the presence behind me, a wave of cold at my back. It wasn't making a sound anymore. It was just there, watching me run. The key scraped, the lock turned. I threw myself inside, slammed the 200-pound door shut, and threw the heavy steel bolt with a deafening clang. I sagged against the wood, my body shaking uncontrollably, me sucking in ragged gasps of air. Silence. For a full 30 seconds, there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of my heart. I thought, maybe I was safe. Thump. A single tremendous impact struck the center of the door, so hard the wood shuddered and the bolt groaned in its housing. It wasn't a knock or a kick. It was a dead weight, concussive force, as if a deer had been thrown against it from a great height. I scrambled away from the door, my back hitting the opposite wall. I stared at the door, at the groaning bolt, and listened to the wind howling outside, carrying with it the faint, fading sound of a woman crying my name. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. The night was a long, waking nightmare spent in the comms room chair, the Mossberg heavy across my lap. The station, my fortress, no longer felt safe. It felt like a trap, and I was the bait. The wind outside had changed. It wasn't just the random sighing gusts of a mountain pass. It had a predatory intelligence. It would die down to nothing, creating a pocket of tense silence, only to slam into the walls in a sudden violent fury. And beneath the wind, I could hear other sounds, a faint, dry scraping along the log walls, like old branches being dragged across the timber, a soft, intermittent tapping against the steel shutters, too light to be the wind, too rhythmic to be random. I was a wreck. By morning, my hands trembled, and every shadow in the dimly lit station seemed to stretch and writhe at the edge of my vision. I was making coffee, the water boiling on the propane stove, when the sound cut through the air. It was a harsh, grating, breeing, a mechanical, metallic ringing that was utterly alien to the station's normal symphony of creaks and hums. The red phone. It sat on the corner of the comms desk, a relic from the Cold War, its crimson plastic garish against the drab green radio equipment. It had no wires leading into the wall, no connection to the satellite dish. As far as I could tell, it was an inert prop, but it was ringing, whirring, burring. My coffee forgotten, I moved towards it, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This was it. This was the real protocol. I lifted the heavy Bakelite receiver. It was surprisingly cold. "Tate," I said, my voice hoarse. A burst of what sounded like radio static crackled on the line. Then a voice spoke. It was flat, artificial, like a machine reading a script. Every syllable was perfectly clipped and devoid of emotion. "Report." One word. An order. I thought of Lena's voice in the woods, the sheer violation of it. There was no code for that. My mind raced through the rulebook, laminated in my memory. Rule #4. Report all anomalous animal sightings. Use code AUA for bipedal ungulates. During my panicked flight back to the station, I had seen something out of the corner of my eye. A flash of movement, something that had been pacing me in the trees. Code AUA, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Saw one. During the event last night. Bipedal ungulate anomaly. There was a long pause on the other end, filled with the sound of crackling static. I could almost feel a distant, cold intelligence processing my words. Acknowledge. AUA. Did you engage? The machine voice asked. Negative. I was evading. Did it use vocalization? The question hit me like a physical blow. They knew it could talk. The memory of Lena Sepp's voice, pleading and cold, threatened to choke me. Affirmative. I managed to say, the word tasting like hash. It used mimicry. Sophisticated mimicry. Another pause, longer this time. The static hissed and popped. Understood. Your report corroborates incident. File 73B. Maintain protocol. Reinforce all entry points. Do not, under any circumstances, engage. Await further instructions. Before I could ask who they were, what incident 73B was, or what the hell was actually happening, the line went dead. I was left holding a silent receiver. The artificial voice seared into my brain. The fear was still there, cold and sharp. But now it had a new companion. Anger. I wasn't just a victim of some random mountain monster. I was a pawn, a sentry stationed on a wall without being told what I was keeping out or in. And Marcus Thorne was my predecessor. Fueled by a desperate need for answers, I began to tear the station apart. I wasn't just looking. I was searching for the kinds of places a man like me, a man like Marcus, would hide something essential. Not in a drawer or a cabinet. It had to be somewhere secure, somewhere personal. Under the bunk mattress, beneath a loose floorboard that groaned when I put my weight on it. I found it. It was a small moleskin-style notebook. Its black cover warped by damp. Tucked inside was Marcus Thorne's private log. His first entries were dated 3 years ago. They were professional, almost indistinguishable from my own. Notes on weather patterns, deer populations, the frustrating quirks of the generator. He joked about the spooky rules and chalked them up to old-timer superstition. Then the tone began to change. October 12th. Had a condition 0 today. Lasted almost 3 hours. The silence. It's not empty. It's full of something. It listens. November 4th. The reflections are wrong. Brought up my polished aluminum geology case to sort my rock samples. Caught a glimpse of the room in the reflection. The chair was by the window, not the table. I looked away, then looked back. The chair was where it should be. I'm not sleeping enough. My blood ran cold. Rule. Us three. No reflective surfaces. I read on. My horror mounting with every page. Marcus became obsessed with the reflections. He started seeing a figure in the polished metal, standing behind his own reflection. He described it as tall, pale, and thin, like a starving man, with a deer's skull for a head, its dark eye sockets fixed on him. He theorized the entity was somehow interdimensional, using reflective surfaces as windows, or maybe even doors. The last few pages were a descent into pure madness. The handwriting was a frantic, sloping scrawl. The pen dug so hard into the paper, it tore through in places. July 9th. The forest moved. I swear to God, it moved. The big cedar by the creek wasn't there yesterday. I know it wasn't. The thing is not just in the forest. It is the forest. It rearranges the board when you're not looking. Then, the final entry. It was dated the day before he disappeared. It was circled several times. It's not mimicry. It's replacement. It doesn't copy the voice. It took the voice. That hiker who went missing last spring, it's still using his voice to call for his dog. Sarah Collier isn't missing. She's broadcasting. I dropped the journal as if it were on fire. The search party wasn't looking for a missing girl. They were walking into an ambush, lured by a recording that the predator itself was now using. It collected people. It collected voices. My gaze drifted to the window, to the heavy steel shutter that blocked the outside world. As I stared at it, a sharp sound that made me jump. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the window. Clear and deliberate. It wasn't the scraping sound from last night. It was a signal. I crept closer, my heart in my throat. Through the small peephole, I saw it. A large raven perched on the windowsill. It looked directly at the peephole, at me, and tapped the glass again with its beak. Then it hopped back, dropped a small dark object onto the sill, and launched into the air, its powerful wings carrying it up and over the roof. My hands shook as I unlatched the heavy shutter and slid it open just a few inches, enough to reach out. Sitting on the dusty wood was a small, old key. It was made of iron, pitted with rust and age. Its design simple and archaic. I had no idea what lock it opened, but as I held its cold, solid weight in my palm, I knew one thing for sure. It was a move. And now, it was my turn to play. The iron key was a cold, heavy question in my pocket. I spent the next hour in a frantic, methodical search, trying it on every lock in the station. The supply cabinets, the gun locker, the petty cash box, the old padlock on the generator shed. Nothing. It fit. None of them. It was a key for a lock I didn't have, a solution to a problem I didn't understand. My priorities shifted. I had to warn them. The search party. O'Connell. I had to tell them to get out. That Sarah Collier was a ghost story being used to bait a trap. I went to the comms console, my hands flying across the controls, switching to the district-wide frequency. 3 Creeks Command. This is Tate at Station 4. Do you copy? Urgent traffic. Only static answered. A loud hiss like a serpent. Any station. This is Ranger Tate. Do you read me? Acknowledge. The static shifted, its pitch and rhythm changing. It was no longer just random noise. Fragments of voices began to surface, like bodies rising from a deep, dark lake. They were faint, distorted, swimming in and out of the white noise. The trees, they're bleeding sap, but it's red, smells like a slaughterhouse. A man's voice, tinny and panicked, with the distinct cadence of a 1970s broadcast. Call for a condition 0 is now on hour 6. It's not lifting. The silence is getting louder. A woman's voice, sharp with terror, maybe from the 90s, then a voice that made my blood freeze. It was Marcus Thorne, clear as day for a few seconds, in the reflection of the case. God. It set wearing my face. The radio wasn't just failing, it was bleeding. Time was coming undone, and Station 4 was the wound, the history of this place, all its fear and death, was bubbling up through the electronics, turning the airwaves into a graveyard. I was listening to the final moments of every ranger who had sat in this chair before me. I shut it off. The sudden silence of the room, almost as deafening as the spectral voices. The feeling of being watched was no longer just a feeling, it was a certainty. The station was a glass jar, and something on the outside was tapping the lid. That night, the sounds were worse. The scraping along the walls was bolder, more rhythmic. It was the sound of something deliberately testing the station's integrity. Around midnight, a sound like a rifle shot exploded through the building. I grabbed the shotgun and did a slow, terrifying sweep of the interior. Nothing was out of place. It wasn't until the next morning, when I dared a look through a peephole, that I saw it. One of the main structural logs of the west wall, a massive piece of Douglas fir, nearly 3 feet thick, had a crack running down its center. It was a deep, angry fissure, splintering the wood from top to bottom. From the crack, a thick, viscous fluid was oozing. It was the color of dark rust, almost black, and it dripped slowly onto the ground below, steaming faintly in the cold morning air. Marcus's words echoed in my head. The trees are bleeding. The forest wasn't just the entity's hiding place, it was its body. And it was starting to break into my home. Just as I was processing this, a garbled transmission burst from the radio, which I hadn't turned back on. It crackled to life on its own. It was O'Connell's voice, raw and ragged with terror. Not deer. They set her, not deer. They set her in the trees. Oh God, Dave, look out. His voice was cut off by a wet, tearing sound. A noise that my combat-trained mind identified immediately as the sound of flesh being ripped from bone. It was followed by a chorus of screams, human screams, tangled with the shriek of a gut-shot elk, the caw of a terrified raven, and something else, a high-pitched, clicking shriek that was utterly inhuman. Then, just as suddenly, silence, not the profound, supernatural silence of a Condition Zero event. This was a dead silence. The silence of a disconnected line. The silence of an entire search party being wiped off the map. They were all gone, consumed, added to the broadcast. I was alone, truly, finally alone. The last man on the mountain, and they would be coming for me next. My death wouldn't just be an end. It would be a recruitment. A frantic, desperate energy seized me. The key, the fucking key. It had to be for something. It was my only move left on the board. I tore through the station again, not with the methodical care of a searcher, but with the brute force of a cornered animal. I kicked over crates, threw aside old tarps, shoved equipment off shelves, and under a dusty workbench in the back of the workshop, I found it, an old, black, iron-banded footlocker. It was so covered in grime and sawdust that it had blended into the shadows. The lock was as old and rusted as the key. My heart hammered. I slid the key into the lock. It resisted for a moment, then turned with a loud, grating click. With trembling hands, I lifted the heavy lid. I had expected a weapon, a flare gun, maybe some explosives, or a map. A way out. It was neither. The inside was lined with faded velvet. Nestled within it was a bizarre piece of machinery. It looked like a cross between an antique radio and some kind of surgical tool. A heavy brass box, a large, delicate-looking vacuum tube on top that pulsed with a faint internal light, and a single polished red button in the center. The faceplate was covered in symbols, geometric and complex, unlike any language I had ever seen. Taped to the inside of the lid was a yellowed, brittle piece of paper. The handwriting was an elegant, old-fashioned cursive, not Marcus's frantic scrawl. This was from someone who had been here long before him. The ink was faded, but the message was terrifyingly clear. This is not a distress signal. This is not a weapon. It is a bell. Do not ring it unless you are prepared for who answers. It doesn't keep them out. It tells them the cage is empty. I sank to my knees on the cold concrete floor. The footlocker opened before me like a profane altar. A wave of nauseating understanding washed over me. The rules, the station, the secrecy. It was never about containing the things in the woods, the AUA, the mimics, the deer things. They were just the dogs in the yard. They were the first, bloody, violent layer of the defense system. The real purpose of my job, of Marcus's job, of every ranger who had ever died on this mountain, was to never ever ring this bell, to suffer in silence, to be taken and replaced, to do anything but admit that the local containment had failed. Ringing this bell was escalating. It was firing a flare into the deepest, darkest part of space and telling something ancient and vast that its experiment had run wild, that its prison was broken. The creatures outside were the jailers. This bell called the warden, and I had no idea if the warden was on my side. The moment of decision passed. The choice was no longer mine to make. The things outside made it for me. The assault began without warning. The scraping and tapping escalated into a full-blown siege. A thunderous boom rocked the entire station, as if a battering ram had struck the east wall, then another on the west. They were coordinated. I scrambled to the peepholes, my flashlight beam cutting a frantic path through the darkness. I couldn't see anything but the writhing trees, but the sounds were undeniable. The heavy log walls, which had stood for over 70 years, groaned and splintered under the onslaught. As if on cue, the weather turned. The wind, which had been a steady howl, rose in pitch to a multi-tonal shriek. It sounded like a chorus of every voice the forest had ever stolen. I could hear Sarah Collier's youthful panic, O'Connell's ragged orders, and the low, sorrowful tones of 100 others I didn't know. The temperature inside the station plummeted. I could see my breath misting in the flashlight beam. A thin, impossible layer of black ice, slick and greasy, began to crawl across the inside of the steel shutters. Then came the final blow, a cataclysmic impact, louder and heavier than all the rest. Struck the north corner of the building. The single light bulb in the workshop flickered violently, then died. The low, reassuring hum of the station's power cut out. I was plunged into absolute darkness, the kind that feels like a physical weight, broken only by the narrow beam of my flashlight. The emergency battery pack for the comms console kicked in with a weak beep. But it wouldn't last the night, and I knew, with a sick certainty, that the magnetic locks on the shutters were tied to the main power. Without it, they would eventually fail. My fortress was now just a timber box, waiting to be cracked open. The generator. The only way to get power back was the generator, and it was outside. Breaking rule, #1, was no longer a choice. It was the only option left, however suicidal. Staying inside was a guarantee of death. Going outside was just a high probability. I'd take those odds. I grabbed the Mossberg from the rack, chambered a round of 00 buckshot, and holstered my Glock. I stuffed my pockets with extra shells and magazines. I took the heaviest maglite I had. My hands were steady. The terror was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it had been superseded by the clarity of the soldier. There is an objective. You either achieve it, or you die trying. I stood at the main door. I could hear them out there, their dry scraping movements, the clicking sounds they made. I took one last, deep breath of the stale air inside my tomb, and I unbolted the door. The world that met me was a Bosch painting brought to life. The wind hit me like a solid wall, tearing the air from my lungs. It was a vortex of swirling snow, ash, and pine needles. The sky above was a sickening, bruised cauldron of violet and green, lit by silent internal flashes of lightning. My flashlight beam cut through the maelstrom, and I saw them. I finally, truly saw them. They were tall, 8 or 9 feet, and stood on powerful digitigrade legs that ended in split, obsidian hooves. Their bodies were a horrific fusion of human and deer, gaunt and skeletal, covered in a tight, pale skin that looked like stretched parchment. Their arms were long and spindly, ending in 3-fingered hands with claws like obsidian shards. But their heads were the skulls of mature stags, crowned with jagged antlers, but the bone was unnaturally elongated, and from the black, empty eye sockets, a faint, hateful red light pulsed with malevolent intelligence. They weren't walking through the woods, they were part of the woods, their forms phasing and flickering, half solid, half shadow. One stood not 20 feet away, its head cocked, watching me. I didn't hesitate. I brought the shotgun to my shoulder and fired. The roar was immense, the recoil jarring. The buckshot tore a fist-sized hole through the creature's chest, but there was no blood, no cry of pain. Its body simply dissolved into a cloud of black, swirling spores, like disturbed soot, before coalescing again, a few yards to the left, completely unharmed. My stomach dropped. They couldn't be killed. There was no time. I ran, head down, sprinting for the generator shed 50 yards away. They were impossibly fast, flanking me in the storm, their clicking shrieks, and the stolen human voices swirling around me. I fired twice more, not to kill, but to suppress, to disorient them. I reached the shed and threw my shoulder against the metal door. It didn't budge. I looked closer. It had been ripped from its hinges and then wedged back into place from the outside. With a surge of adrenaline, I tore it free. The generator was a ruin. The fuel lines were severed. The engine block was smashed open with brute force, and the control panel was a tangle of shredded, sparking wires. It was a deliberate tactical act of sabotage. They had cut me off completely. It was over. With the last of my strength, I scrambled back to the station. A clawed hand scraped down my back, tearing through my jacket like paper. I threw myself through the doorway, spun, and slammed the heavy door shut, throwing the bolt just as the full weight of one of the creatures slammed against it from the other side. I slumped to the floor, my chest heaving, my hope extinguished. I could hear the wood of the walls beginning to splinter and crack in earnest now. They were done playing. They were coming in. Then I heard my own voice, clear as day, from just outside the door. It was a perfect mimicry of my own panicked terror. Eli! Oh God, Eli! Let me in, please. It said to me, let me in. It was the final turn of the screw, the ultimate psychological assault. My eyes, frantic in the sweeping beam of my flashlight, fell upon the open footlocker. The vacuum tube on the strange device within pulsed with its soft, steady light, a calm heartbeat in the heart of the storm. It tells them the cage is empty. I crawled on my hands and knees into the workshop. The station groaned around me like a dying beast. A heavy claw punched through the wall near the door, spraying splinters and foul-smelling sap into the room. Death by the jailers, or a reckoning with the warden. I reached the beacon. My hand, covered in dirt and blood, hovered over the smooth red button. I closed my eyes, picturing Henderson's tired face, Marcus's terrified scrawl, the empty look in the creature's glowing red eyes. With a final ragged breath, I pushed the button. There was no explosion, no flash of divine light. For a single, silent second after my finger lifted from the button, nothing happened. The station continued to groan under the assault. A claw scraped down the door. Then came the sound. It didn't come through my ears. It bloomed in the center of my skull. A low, resonant hum that vibrated through my bones and teeth. It was a frequency so deep and so ancient it felt like the resonant tone of creation itself being played backwards. The single vacuum tube on the beacon glowed with a fierce, steady light, no longer pulsing but burning. Instantly, the assault on the station stopped. The pounding, the scraping, the shrieking voices on the wind, all of it ceased, as if a switch had been thrown. The sudden silence was more shocking than the cacophony it replaced. I scrambled to the peephole, my eye pressing against the cold metal. The deer creatures were frozen in place. The hateful red light in their skull sockets flickered, dimmed, and then went out. They looked like statues for a moment, inert and lifeless. Then, a look of what I could only describe as panic seemed to seize them. They began to back away from the station, their movements frantic and clumsy, but they weren't running. They were dissolving, their pale forms destabilized, losing cohesion, their substance melting like smoke back into the trees, the ground, the very air. They were being recalled, uninstalled. The deep hum in my skull intensified, and the world outside began to unravel. The wind died. The unnatural storm vanished, the swirling snow and ash evaporating into nothingness. But the reality that lay beneath it was infinitely more terrifying. The forest was still there, but it was wrong. It was a cheap imitation, a crude architectural model of a forest. The trees were spaced with perfect mathematical precision. The branches grew at clean, impossible 90-degree angles. The deep, rich texture of the bark was gone, replaced by a smooth, uniform surface like molded plastic. I looked up, scanning for the bruised sky, for the moon. They were gone. In their place was a perfect, featureless, light-devouring black. It wasn't the darkness of night. It was the absolute, suffocating void of a deleted file. From the direction of the mountain's peak, a new light appeared. It was a cold, sterile, blue-violet light. It didn't cast rays or shadows. It pulsed with a slow, silent, inexorable rhythm, and it was growing, not just getting brighter, but expanding, consuming the false forest as it came. The imitation trees, at the edge of its influence, didn't burn or fall. They simply vanished, pixel by pixel, dissolving into the void behind them. The very ground seemed to be peeling away before it, like a page being ripped from a book. This wasn't a rescue. This was a deep clean, a system-wide format. My hand, shaking, went to the small digital recorder I kept on my belt. I knew, with a certainty that transcended fear, that I would not survive this. My existence was a bug in the code, and a patch was coming. I pressed record. Log entry, July 16th. Time, irrelevant. My voice was a choked whisper, filled with a terrifying awe. This is Senior Ranger Eli Tate, Station 4, Clackamas District. If anyone finds this recording, the rules are real. They're not superstition. They're not protocol. They're a goddamn leash. And it just broke. I took a ragged breath, my eyes fixed on the approaching wave of uncreation. The blue-violet light was close now, and I could feel its clean, cold emptiness on my skin. The rules weren't to keep it in. They were to keep us from calling something worse. The beacon, it doesn't call for help. A sound escaped my throat, something between a laugh and a sob. It tells them the cage is empty. It suts a reset, a system wipe. Oh God, the light. The low hum in my bones began to rise in pitch, climbing into an unbearable, piercing shriek. The blue-violet light filled the peephole, and the sound of it filled the recording. A sound of pure, overwhelming digital static. The sound of a universe being erased and overwritten. It was the last sound my recorder and I would ever hear.